Picture a scene like this. The needle in his teeth is the only dry thing left on his body, and if he drops it now, 30 men go down with his ship. His name was never written in any log that survived, but sailmakers rarely got their names written down at all. What we know is the kind of night it was, the North Atlantic, late autumn, the wind screaming through rigging that had already lost one topsail to the storm. The mainsail has torn along a seam, a long ragged mouth of canvas flapping like something alive, and unless it is closed within the hour, the ship will broach and roll. He is on his knees on a deck tilted at an angle no deck should hold, salt water sluicing across his knuckles, and between his teeth is a single steel needle, curved slightly, no longer than his little finger. It is, by any measure, an unremarkable object. And yet, in this moment, it is the only thing standing between this crew and the bottom of the sea. He threads it by feel, because his eyes are useless in this spray and dark. He has done this 10,000 times. His hands know the motion the way a heart knows how to beat. Push, pull, tension, push, pull, and with every stitch the tear closes a fraction of an inch. Somewhere below, a woman is praying in a language the rest of the crew does not speak. Somewhere above, the mast groans like it is deciding whether to hold. It is worth pausing here, in the howling middle of this, to ask a question that has nothing to do with storms at all. How old do you think this little tool in his mouth actually is? Older than the ship? Older than sailing itself? Older, in fact, than almost anything else human beings have ever made on purpose. To understand why a needle was aboard that ship at all, why it existed, why it was steel, why it was shaped exactly the way it was, we have to go back, not 3 days before this storm, but considerably further than that. We have to go back to a cave in Siberia, to a bitter, howling cold that makes a mid-Atlantic gale look almost gentle. In the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia sits a limestone cave known today as Denisova Cave, a site that has quietly rewritten large portions of the human story since excavations began there in earnest in the 20th century. Among the bones, tools, and fragments recovered from its layers, archaeologists found something startling: a needle carved from bird bone, polished smooth, pierced with a tiny eye at one end. Researchers have dated this object to roughly 50,000 years old, making it, as of current evidence, one of the oldest known needles with an eye ever found on Earth. 50,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. Long before writing, before agriculture, before anything we would recognize as a city, someone in that freezing cave sat down, probably by firelight, and painstakingly bored a hole through a sliver of bone thinner than a chopstick. Historians and archaeologists who study early tool use, including specialists writing on the Denisova finds, describe the precision required as remarkable for its time. This was not a crude puncturing tool, but something clearly meant to pull thread through hide. And that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. A needle with an eye does something an awl or a bone punch cannot. It does not just poke a hole and let you push sinew through afterward. It carries the thread with it in a single motion, allowing someone to stitch two pieces of hide together tightly, evenly, repeatedly, to make, essentially, tailored clothing rather than draped clothing. This is where the story takes its first sharp turn, and where a debate among archaeologists becomes genuinely fascinating. Ice Age Europe was home to more than one kind of human. Neanderthals had lived across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, superbly adapted, physically robust, clearly intelligent. And yet, by roughly 40,000 years ago, they were gone, while a newer arrival, us, Homo sapiens, spread and endured. Why? That question has occupied paleoanthropologists for generations, and there is no single accepted answer. Historians and archaeologists still debate it openly. But one hypothesis, advanced prominently by researchers such as Gilligan, who has written extensively on the archaeology of clothing, points squarely at this humble tool. Sites associated with Homo sapiens across Ice Age Europe show eyed needles and evidence of fitted, layered clothing. Sites associated with Neanderthals, even in equally cold regions, show far less evidence of tailored garments, mostly simpler draped hides, pinned or wrapped rather than stitched close to the body. The theory, disputed and still being tested, is straightforward and almost eerie in its simplicity. A draped hide leaks warmth at every gap. A stitched fitted garment, sewn close at the wrists, the neck, the waist, traps heat the way a modern parka does. In a world where a single brutal winter could be the difference between a surviving band and an extinct one, a needle that let you sew snug, layered, wind-resistant clothing may have been, quite literally, a survival technology. Not decisively proven, but taken seriously by serious scholars. Which means the tiny bone needle from that Siberian cave may not just be an old tool. It may be one of the reasons any of us are here to tell this story at all. Back on that heaving Atlantic deck, none of this history is in the sailmaker's mind, obviously. He is thinking about the next stitch, and the one after that, and whether his fingers will still bend once this is over. But it is worth noticing that the tool in his teeth and the tool from that frozen cave share an unbroken lineage. The material changed, the shape refined, but the basic idea, a slender shaft, an eye, a thread pulled through in one continuous motion, never needed to be reinvented. It only needed to travel. And it did travel, across an almost unbelievable distance of time and geography, taking up new forms as it went. Bone gave way to bronze in some regions. Bronze gave way, eventually, to iron and then steel. And it was in this later chapter, the chapter of metal, of markets, of merchants, that the needle stopped being merely a household tool and became something closer to a commodity that moved along trade routes the way spice and silk did. Historical records from medieval and early modern China described steel needlemaking as an established craft by at least the medieval period, with fine steel needles produced in specialized workshops and traded outward along routes connecting east and west. Some of the earliest detailed European descriptions of manufactured steel needles as luxury imports date to the medieval period, when needles arriving from the east were prized enough to be mentioned specifically in trade accounts, valued for a fineness that local blacksmiths struggled to match. A well-made needle, thin enough not to tear delicate cloth yet strong enough not to snap, was a small marvel of metallurgy, and for a long stretch of history, the finest ones were an imported luxury, not a household given. Back aboard the ship, the storm has not eased. If anything, it has found a second wind, and the sailmaker's needle now has competition. The deck itself is shifting under him in a way that makes kneeling nearly impossible. A wave breaks over the rail, and for a moment the whole world is just noise and cold water, and when it clears he is still there, still stitching, blood now visible at one knuckle where the needle has driven back through his own skin instead of the canvas. He does not stop. He cannot stop. The sail is half closed. Half is not enough. It is worth sitting with that image a moment longer, because it is not just drama for its own sake. It reflects something true about how needles were actually used at sea for centuries. Historical maritime records and surviving ships' inventories from the Age of Sail describe sailmakers, sometimes called sailmakers' mates, as specialized crew whose entire function was maintaining canvas, and whose needle kits, heavier, triangular-pointed needles meant for thick sailcloth, quite different from a household sewing needle, were considered essential ship's equipment, checked and restocked at port alongside food and water. A torn sail in open ocean was not an inconvenience. It could be, and often was, a death sentence for the vessel. The needle, in that context, was not a domestic tool at all. It was survival equipment, no less critical than a compass or an anchor. This is the second tier of the storm, both literally and in the story we are telling, because the needle in the sailmaker's mouth now carries two entirely different kinds of weight. It is, physically, the last defense of a ship in crisis. And it is, historically, the descendant of a bone splinter from an Ice Age cave that may have helped decide which species of human survived the Pleistocene. Neither fact cancels the other out. They sit inside the same small object at the same time, which is precisely what makes an everyday object like this one so strange to think about closely. And there is a third layer still to come. One that will reframe almost everything said so far, because the needle's steel itself, the very material letting it survive being driven through wet, heavy sailcloth over and over without snapping, has its own hidden history of industry, empire, and a small English town that quietly became, for a time, the needle capital of the entire world. To find that town, we have to leave the storm for a moment and travel to the English Midlands, to a river valley in Worcestershire where, by the 18th and 19th centuries, an extraordinary concentration of needlemaking had taken root. The town is Redditch, and its story is one of those strange pockets of history where an ordinary place becomes, almost by accident, indispensable to daily life across the entire globe. Records held by local trade histories and by institutions such as the Forge Mill Needle Museum, which today occupies a preserved historic needle mill in Redditch, described how the town's position, close to the Arrow River, which could power watermills, and near sources of iron and later fine steel, made it a natural center for needle production starting as early as the 17th century and expanding enormously through the Industrial Revolution. By the 19th century, needlemaking in and around Redditch had become mechanized in ways almost unrecognizable from the individual craftsman bent over a single needle by candlelight. The most striking figure often cited from this period is almost hard to believe on first hearing. At its industrial peak in the 19th century, the Redditch needlemaking district is estimated, according to museum and local industrial history records, to have produced a large share, by some estimates as much as 90%, of the world's sewing needles. 90%, a single valley in the English countryside, effectively clothing dressmakers, tailors, sailmakers, embroiderers, and households across Europe, the Americas, and beyond, all from mills powered by one modest river. The manufacturing process itself, as documented in surviving mill records and museum reconstructions, was almost operatic in its danger. Workers called pointers ground needle tips against fast-spinning grindstones, producing fine steel dust that hung in the air of the workshop like fog. That dust, inhaled daily, caused a severe and often fatal lung disease that came to be known, grimly, as grinder's asthma or pointer's rot among local communities. An occupational hazard so well known that some workshops reportedly took to using primitive fan systems or wet grinding methods to try to reduce it, with only partial success. The tiny needle, in other words, and its very manufacture, carried a hidden cost paid by the hands and lungs of the people who made it possible. It is a strange thing to hold in your mind. The needle as a life-saving tool at sea, and simultaneously a tool whose production quietly shortened the lives of the workers who made it in bulk. Neither cancels the other. Both are simply true, layered into the same slender shaft of steel. And here, the story bends in a direction almost no one expects, because the needle's Steel Age reinvention did not stay confined to cloth and canvas at all. The same essential shape, a hollow or eyed shaft fine enough to pierce skin without excessive damage, would soon be adapted for an entirely different purpose, one that had nothing to do with sails or shirts and everything to do with medicine. In 1853, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood, working in Edinburgh, is widely credited in medical histories with developing a practical hollow needle attached to a syringe for injecting medication directly beneath the skin, building on and refining earlier experiments by others working around the same period, including the French surgeon Charles Gabriel Prévost. Wood's device was reportedly first used to deliver morphine directly into a patient's tissue rather than requiring it to be swallowed, and it worked with a speed and precision that oral medicine simply could not match. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it quietly reframes the entire tale up to this point. Every needle we have discussed so far, the bone needle in a Siberian cave, the steel needle bought and sold along ancient trade routes, the sailmaker's needle closing a tear at sea, existed to join two things together, cloth to cloth, hide to hide. The hypodermic needle inverted that purpose entirely. It was not built to close a wound in fabric. It was built to open, briefly and precisely, a doorway into the human body itself, so that medicine could travel where the body's own defenses could not easily let it in unassisted. Historians of medicine note that the hypodermic needle transformed the treatment of pain, infection, and later, in the 20th century, disease prevention on a scale hard to overstate. The same slender shaft that a Denisova ancestor once used to stitch a hide coat together against the Ice Age cold had, tens of thousands of years later, become the instrument delivering insulin to diabetics, antibiotics to the infected, and eventually vaccines that would be administered to billions of people across the 20th and 21st centuries. The object never really changed its essential shape, only its direction, inward instead of through, changed everything about what it could do. And that reframing sends us back, almost inevitably, to that ship in the storm, because now the needle held between the sailmaker's teeth looks slightly different than it did at the start of this story. It is not merely a scrap of steel closing a tear in canvas. It is one branch, one very specific and very practical branch, of a technology whose other branches were, at that very moment in history or very near it, beginning to be reimagined as instruments of medicine, capable of reaching directly into a human body to save a life rather than a ship. Back in the storm, the resolution comes the way most true maritime resolutions do, without music, without triumph, simply through exhaustion and endurance. The sailmaker finishes the last stitch sometime after the worst of the wind has already begun to ease, his hands numb, the canvas patched not beautifully but soothfully enough to hold. Ship's logs and first-hand maritime accounts from the Age of Sail repeatedly describe this exact pattern. Damage control performed not by dramatic heroics, but by monotonous, freezing, repetitive needlework performed by exhausted crew, stitch after stitch after stitch, until the danger simply, quietly passes. By morning, if the ship survived, the sea often looked almost apologetic. Flat, gray, indifferent, as though the previous night's fury belonged to some other ocean entirely. The sailmaker would have coiled his needle kit, dried it as best he could, and gone back to being an anonymous, essential presence aboard a vessel that depended on him without ever quite thinking about him. This, too, is part of the pattern historians of maritime labor point out. Sailmakers rarely appear by name in ship's records, even though their work was considered indispensable to keeping a vessel seaworthy. Meanwhile, on land, the needle story kept accelerating in ways that would reach even ordinary households far from any port. In 1846, the American inventor Elias Howe patented a lock-stitch sewing machine, one of the pivotal steps in a race of competing inventors working on mechanized sewing during that decade. Isaac Singer, working slightly later, refined and aggressively commercialized a more practical version. And by the 1850s and 1860s, Singer sewing machines were being sold across America and Europe, eventually becoming one of the first mass-marketed household machines in history, sold on installment plans that let ordinary working families afford them over time. The significance of this shift is easy to underestimate today. Before mechanized sewing, a single shirt might take a skilled seamstress many hours of hand-stitching to complete. Clothing was expensive, often patched and repatched across a family for years before being discarded. The sewing machine, powered by that same simple needle and thread principle refined over tens of thousands of years, collapsed that labor time dramatically, and historians of the Industrial Revolution frequently cite the sewing machine as one of the technologies that helped make store-bought, ready-made clothing an ordinary possibility for working households rather than a luxury reserved for the wealthy. So in the span of about a century, the needle had quietly done three enormous things at once, each almost invisible from the others. It had kept the ships of empires crossing oceans, sail patched, cargo delivered, trade routes intact. It had reached into the human body itself as a hypodermic instrument, becoming one of medicine's most essential tools. And, mechanized, it had helped reshape how ordinary families across two continents clothed themselves, shifting labor from the exhausted hands of individual seamstresses to factories and household machines. None of this required the needle itself to change its basic shape very much at all. A slender shaft, a point, an eye or a hollow channel. That is essentially the entire design, unchanged in its logic since a Siberian cave 50,000 years ago, and yet capable of underpinning clothing, commerce, empire, and modern medicine all at once. Which brings us, gently, to where the needle sits today, largely unnoticed, in the corners of ordinary modern life. In hospitals and clinics, hypodermic needles, now almost always single-use, sealed in sterile plastic, discarded after one injection, deliver vaccines, blood draws, insulin, and countless other treatments millions of times a day across the world, a direct descendant of Alexander Wood's Edinburgh device from 1853. In traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture needles, whose use historians trace back through texts such as the Huangdi Neijing, compiled roughly around the 2nd century BCE, though drawing on older practices, continue to be used by licensed practitioners across the globe, including in clinics throughout the United States and Europe, where acupuncture has been incorporated into some conventional pain management programs. And ordinary sewing needles, virtually unchanged in form from those Redditch factories, still sit in sewing kits in millions of homes, waiting for a button to fall off a coat or a hem to fray loose. There is also, quietly, a museum you can visit if you want to hold this history in your own hands rather than just hear about it. The Forge Mill Needle Museum in Redditch, England, occupies an actual historic needle mill, water wheel, and grinding stones preserved on-site, and displays needle scouring machinery, hand tools, and records from the industry's peak, a place where the enormous, near-invisible global reach of this small object becomes suddenly, physically tangible. It's worth pausing here to ask why any of this should matter to someone listening tonight, someone who has probably not stitched a sail or ground a needle by hand in their life, and the honest answer is something like this. Almost nothing in modern daily life announces its own age. The stitch holding your jacket closed, the vaccine you received last winter, the quilt folded at the end of the bed, none of it visibly carries 50,000 years of history, yet all of it quietly does. Every time a needle passes through cloth or skin, it repeats a motion first performed by an unnamed person in an Ice Age cave who was simply trying not to freeze to death. Recognizing that thread of continuity does not change your evening, but it does change, just slightly, how ordinary the ordinary really is. There is something almost humbling about a tool this small carrying this much weight. A bone needle from a freezing cave, one candidate in a serious, still debated theory for why our species endured an ice age that ended the Neanderthals. A steel needle traded along medieval routes as a genuine luxury good. A sailmaker's needle, unglamorous and essential, standing between a ship and the bottom of an ocean. A hollow needle in Edinburgh, redirecting an entire tool's purpose from closing wounds in fabric to opening a careful, healing path into the human body itself. And a needle mill in one English river valley, at its height, quietly equipping most of the sewing world from a single small town most people have never heard of. None of these facts erase each other. They sit together, layered, inside the same slender shape, the way the sailmaker's needle from the opening of the story carried, without knowing it, all of that history between his teeth in the middle of a storm. Neither he nor his shipmates would likely ever describe to anyone afterward, because surviving it was simply what the job required. If he made it through that night, and it is plausible, though undocumented in any specific record, that many skilled sailmakers did, he would have coiled that needle back into its worn leather kit by morning light, salt-crusted and unremarkable, ready for the next tear, the next storm, the next quiet, anonymous act of holding something together against the odds. Just an ordinary needle, doing what needles have always done, one stitch, one wound, one seam at a time, since long before anyone thought to write any of it down. So the next time a needle passes so briefly through your hands, closing a button, receiving a vaccine, threading a hem, what do you think it's quietly carrying with it? And what other objects sitting around you right now might be hiding a history just as old? Main sources for this story include archaeological research on the Denisova Cave bone needle and Ice Age clothing technology by scholars such as Ian Gilligan, museum records and exhibits from the Forge Mill Needle Museum in Redditch, England, and historical accounts of the development of the hypodermic syringe attributed to Alexander Wood. The full list is in the description.